because of the introduction of a very fundamental human rights formal guarantee. Unfortunately, as Huntington also really predicted, the idea of a tide is also one of ebb and flow. So it was the flow and then the ebb. And over the late 1990s and into the 2000s, we found in Africa, to a great extent, that multipartyism has become tokenism, that there had been elections in each country, but very few actual changes of power, that there had increasingly been uses of the constitutionalized state and the form of democracy to benefit the incumbent in power in these particular states. So against that background, I thought I will look at essentially 5 areas, very briefly, in terms of human rights violations, and discuss the role of the African regional human rights system in addressing these kinds of human rights violations. And my argument is really that it is when human rights violations are at their most dire, when you have massive violations, when the domestic system really is being manipulated, it is exactly at that point where recourse to a regional system becomes all the more important. So the first of these human rights issues is that of serious or massive human rights violations. I think often in Africa you'd think of human rights in this context. Rwanda, as I mentioned, and Darfur would be examples of such massive human rights violations. Violations that would encompass extrajudicial killings, disappearances, something that's very familiar to you in Latin America and Argentina, and also killing or rape, etc., on a very extensive scale. Now, while in Latin America, I think, you associate these massive violations directly with the state, that most of these violations are state-sponsored, the situation in Africa is not so clear-cut. In a situation like Rwanda, for example, the violence, the genocide, to a very important extent orchestrated and directed by the state, was also fed by long-standing ethnic tension and animosity between groups. A situation like that in Somalia, for example, warring factions causing great distress and violations to many, many individuals and groups without state-sponsored violence being directed. Although, I mean, you could say that Somalia is a failed state and that there are surrogate states or state entities that are responsible for these violations. In Sudan, in Darfur as well, we know that the Sudanese government is ultimately responsible for the violations of the rights of people in Darfur. It is state-sponsored, but it is in collusion and together and coinciding with long-standing divisions and conflict between groups within the country. Now, these violations are also in Africa often characterized by movement of people across borders or within countries. So two of the great massive violation issues in Africa would be those of refugees and internally displaced persons. And I quote in the handout there one case just to illustrate the African Commission's role. There's the Mauritanian slavery case, a case in which in Mauritania, in the Sahel, in the Sahara Desert region of Africa, there was essentially ethnic infused tension between the so-called Moors, people of a more Arab background, and the so-called black tribes that had come from Senegal in the south. Practices akin to slavery were still tolerated in the society, and the group affected by that essentially entered into forms of civil disobedience, to the extent that the government adopted very severe repressive measures against these groups, and practices reminiscent of what happened in Latin America actually happened there, in terms of disappearance of many of these men who led the civil disobedience campaigns, dispersion of people across borders. A case was brought to the African Commission, and clearly enough, Mauritania was found in violation. The other case we have there, the first and the only substantive case so far decided by the African Court, is a case that pertains to the very early period in Libya, when Gaddafi was bombing his own people. According to the available evidence, the court in that instance issued a judgment, an order for provisional measures, which was directed at the state. Now, obviously, in a political context such as that in Libya, you could also express your misgivings about the potential role of a court judgment in a context. But it is important if an African institution adds its voice and set factual parameters, because it is very often easy for African leaders within a situation like that to say that there's a conspiracy of Western powers at work, and if an African institution, the Commission or the Court, comes out with a very clear, unequivocal finding, that in a sense takes the wind out of the sails of dictators. In this regard, I just want to mention that all the case law of the African Commission in this regard has been heavily influenced by the Velasquez-Rodriguez case against Honduras that I'm sure you're all familiar with. The idea that states have to investigate, have to prosecute and punish those responsible has been really copied and inserted into the African jurisprudence. So I would say that that again filters through down to the domestic level through the jurisprudence of the African Commission, and it is a very interesting way in which there is a cross-country, cross-continental dialogue between the systems ongoing. The second issue in terms of human rights violations is that of manipulation within legal margins, what I call the compromised constitutionalism in electoral democracies. I mentioned this briefly before. The idea that in the post-1990 Africa, instead of getting true multi-partyism in place, what often happened is that the frame of the new constitution was used and manipulated so that the action by the incumbent was no longer an action that was extra legal, but was in the law, but manipulating and abusing the law to the extent of upholding position and privilege. For example, ensuring that opponents cannot run by criminalizing conduct. So ostensibly, the conduct of a potential opposition party leader would be criminal. The person would go through the process of trials, would be convicted, and would be sentenced. Or the